In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to make a realistic lead guitar patch using a synth and a guitar amp simulator, and it'll sound like this. The basic technique to creating this patch is simply to take a straightforward saw wave based patch and run it through a guitar amp simulator plugin. So we'll show you that to you right now. Here we've got a synth, Dune CM, with our basic saw wave patch. And we've added an instance of Native Instruments Guitar Rig 5, but you can use pretty much any guitar amp sim to achieve this. So in the plugin, we've just used the very first preset, 1993 Hot Solo Rig, and this will run our saw wave through an amp simulator, a speaker simulator, and some delay, and the result sounds much more like a real guitar. It sounds a bit flat and static though, and one way we can introduce a little bit more life and movement to each note is by adding some Unison Detune on the synth. And an easy way to achieve this on Dune CM is with the FAT controls, which introduce per oscillator Unison Detune. So if we just crank this up very slightly, that should be all we need. You'll need a small amount of this, too much will make it sound unnatural. Already this gives us a quite realistic sounding patch, but if you want it to sound even more convincing, there's a few things you can do. When a guitarist plucks a guitar string with their pick, it will very briefly produce a high-pitched note just as the pick is striking the string. And it's not really a musical note, it's just a sort of high-pitched glitch. And we can use a modulation to introduce this to our sound. So what we're going to do is set up the second oscillator to produce this high-pitched sound. And you'll need to crank the semitones value up to about 2 octaves, and you'll probably get the best results if you don't tune it to exactly 2 octaves, but something a little bit less musical, so we'll go for 21 semitones. Now we just want this element of the sound to be introduced very briefly at the start of each note, so we can use the modulation envelope in the synth to achieve this. So we set up the source as the mod envelope, and we're going to set up the destination as the oscillator mix. Crank up the amount to say 50%. And now, whenever we play a note, the secondary oscillator will be introduced briefly at the start, according to the modulation envelope settings here. So let's try it. That's a little bit too much, so and now we can adjust the amount of the modulation to make the effect more or less obvious. A big part of the realism of a patch like this will come down to the MIDI programming that you use. So we'll give you a quick tour of the MIDI part that we programmed for our little demo tune, so you can see some of the tricks we've employed there. So in the first part, we've used some pitch bend, create these cool bends at the start, as well as a bit of vibrato over here. And another thing we've done is we've programmed some very guitar-like licks and phrases and runs. And if you don't really know how to do this, you could always get hold of some guitar MIDI files for real guitar parts and have a look at those and see if you can figure out how some of the licks work and perhaps incorporate them into your own music. We've also used some variation of the velocity to emphasize certain notes and make them a little bit more aggressive. And in this more rhythm focused section here, we've used the velocity again to emulate the way a guitarist's downstrokes will be more powerful than their upstrokes. So in some passages we've programmed alternating sequences of loud and soft notes. Also, on these short chords here, we've varied the velocity of the individual notes in them. And this first chord here would be played as a downstroke. So the guitarist would strike both strings fairly hard. But on this upstroke, it's more likely that the higher notes will be played harder, noticeably harder than the lower note. So this can make some of the chords sound a little brighter than others. We've also been quite liberal with the timing in our piece. We haven't programmed it always exactly on the beat, and we've sometimes overlapped the notes a little bit. So just have a play around with that till you get something that sounds a little bit more natural and less synthetic. One last trick we've employed for further realism is to mimic the guitarist's use of palm muting, which can be used to produce a duller, more percussive effect on certain notes by using the synth's filter envelope. So we're modulating the decay of the filter envelope so that some notes suddenly get very dull, whereas other ones stay fully open. And you can see this in the parts we've programmed here. These parts high up here, this is with the decay pushed right up, so the filter will stay open and bright, and these notes here, the decay of the filter is being set very low, so it will quickly close down and give a more percussive effect, and we can hear that here. And to show you the difference this makes, let's remove the automation. And a few finishing touches for this particular sound. To make it fit in better with the electronic beat we've got here, we've rolled off some of the bottom end and boosted the top a little bit so it can compete with the more full range kind of sound you'd get from a modern electronic production. And we also reduced the lows a little bit just before the guitar amp simulator to give it a little more crunch so it's not too dull and bassy sounding in part. So there you have it, that's how you make a realistic sounding lead guitar patch using synthesis and the guitar amp simulation.